Now, you might think, we've got a good matte, we're done. But we haven't actually matched and composited the shot yet. And just because we're working with an illustrated background doesn't mean that we don't still do our work as compositors. I know that the client is pretty psyched with the look of this background artwork. Look how broken it is when you look at it like that. That's Hollywood, baby. But in order for this scene to work, given the contrast that I want in the foreground, for them to look like they're driving around in daylight, which we're not even quite there yet, I really want the background to be a bit brighter. So let me just experiment here with an exposure effect. And if I dial that up, somewhere in here, it's about the right amount of brightness, but those foreground elements, I just know the client's not going to like that look. So let me just see if I can get away with something here. Cut that out. Close all these. And we're just going to take this and apply it to the background. Yeah. And then if I copy that with property links and paste it here, then I'm free to just adjust the foreground one to taste, but I think it's already, that's more or less what I was after. Let me see now if I can match them in the foreground to that. So I'll go ahead and do this with a curves effect. Now, believe it or not, we're going to do this the same way we would do anything, which is to say channel by channel. So it's going to be a little weird, right? Because the artwork is such that green, okay, but red has almost no darks in it, and blue has only the lightness in the clouds. Yeah, interesting. So in this green or master channel, I'm seeing that I want to gamma up a bit, and I could see keeping the shadows a bit dark. And okay, that will do for the green channel. Then over in red, switching curves also to red. Well, this is interesting. How do I match this? I would say that I'm just going to gamma up a bit on the red. And you can see that even in cartoon world, that's starting to look a little bit more realistic, if I'm free to use that word. And then in blue, I'm going to go the opposite way. And remember, the goal is, if this were a black and white photo sitting there in front of you, would you buy it? Would you buy off on it, that is? Now, let's just see, what can I do with the highlights? I think I could bring them actually back this way just a bit. Okay, I like that pretty well. Let's take another look at red. Yeah, it's working. I mean, the blacks are dark, but there are blacks that darken in the background, in that tree. And that's the result. Okay, so now, subjectively, I have made them a bit too red. So, although they do match the background pretty well, I just need to ease off both of these a little bit. And I think something more like that is going to be the ticket. I might gamma up a little bit more. I might even lose out this holding, well, hold the blacks a little bit. But I don't really want it too crazy contrasty. I'm going to call that good for right now and move on to the next one. This is going to be the same process as before, but it's going to be shortcutted a bit. Definitely looks like we're going to need a new background comp. So if I reveal this one in the project, call this one background 1, and then when I duplicate it, this one's called 2. Command Option / swaps it in. Now I'll open that one up. I can close the other one so I don't get confused. And once again, I will lock off the foreground. And now we're going to need to, first of all, move this down and into place and probably scale it up. And I can do that by dragging because now I am in the same comp. If locking comps is confusing, I'm only dealing with 2 comps. And right now I'm in the timeline that corresponds to this comp viewer. And then when I go over here, I continue seeing that viewer. I think that was clear, but just in case you're losing track. So I'll scale this up so that it fills the window here. And then I'm gonna need to do something different with the background. So let's figure that out. I think I could get away with something like that. So just leaving out that other midground. Let's see how much I can slide this down. Not much. So to compensate, I'm also going to repo the middle ground layer up. And it's not so much about continuity right now as it is about creating a nice looking composition. Yeah, this is going to work well. So in other words, my excuse is we've changed kind of the angle of the shot, and that is making things look different. Let's try that. Go back to half res and loop up a preview. I like it. I think I want the foreground to be a bit bigger and lower. So I'm going to reset the scale on this to 100% and then just scoot it down a bit. I know this lack of interactive dragging is kind of a drag. I think that's probably going to do it. And then let's actually start the adjustment by just pasting in the one we had before that sometimes even works. So I'm going to take the same curves and put it here. And it's pretty close. I think that I don't know if I want to mess with the blue as much. Just going to let her be a little cooler. And this is subjective. It has to do with kind of just how I want her to look, and it's all fluid. I may go back and look at the other one and decide, yeah, you know what, that would be better too if I just kind of, but particularly in the lower, the blacks, I'm going to let blue kind of sit where it was, and then something like that. Let's go back to the first frame and just look at the transition between the two shots. So there, from there. Okay, I like this adjustment better. So in fact, I improved on my first one, and such is life. Just paste it in, undo, redo. It's in the ballpark. I think now, having done this, actually, I'm free to go back more on a little bit more warmth. And I think that these shots are similar enough that I can just take this one and paste it. I could also link them together the way I did the other time, but we can adjust it further. It's possible that, for example, the look of the car versus the outside, they're fighting with each other. The background is very saturated. We're just letting it be that because that's kind of the look of it. So this is not final, but this is where I'm going to leave it for now. So having done all that, it's time for a little bit of tidying up and some last looks on these first two shots in the sequence before we move on to the final one. Okay, I've organized things a little bit better in this comp, and before I move on to the third shot, there's one more adjustment that I think would really make this shot work in a way that it's not now, which is just to add a bit of light wrap between this very bright background and particularly the interior of the car. You see it's going from black to bright sky, and all the edges are looking a little dark, suspiciously so, yes? So here's how I'm going to make my light wrap. I'll duplicate the keyed layer. I don't need these effects. Let me just solo it so you can see what's going on. I'm going to go to a very strange effect, stylize, find edges. Now, if you've ever seen artwork from the 1990s, you know that Photoshop artists went crazy with this thing for a while. And it's because they didn't know what the heck it was for. So now I'm going to show you what it's for. I mean, not that I don't love that look. We're going to go to channel, shift channels, and we'll go alpha full on, and then set each of these to alpha, red, green, and blue. And now I move this above Find Edges, and it actually finds the edges. And if I want the highlighted areas to be white, I invert it. I can then add a blur. We'll go with a Gaussian blur on top of that. And as I blur it out, I now have a nice Luma matte, which I can use over the rest of the image. Now, in order to make this match, let's give it a color somewhat like the background. I've also used this to hold out the background itself if the background has a lot of varying colors, but here they're all pretty much in the yellow-orange range. So let's just give it that color. Something like that, maybe a bit more saturated since that's kind of how it looks. And I will set the layer to be an add. Now watch out because it's nuclear and it's filling both the outside and the inside. So now I need another matted foreground layer. Again, I don't need these effects, which I will make the alpha matte for that. Now it's held out to just the edges. It's just too strong. So I'll dial it back. Now for the car edges, somewhere in there is looking pretty good to me. Maybe still a little strong, but something like that. But for the faces, I don't want it anywhere near that strong. Like if I'm just looking at her face, I think I want it more down around here. So about a third the amount. So there's a simple way to accomplish that. Just going to make a rectangular mat around that top layer that's holding out the edges. And then I'll switch to an ellipse tool. And I'm just going to draw a mask around her and one around the front of his face. Just angle that around a little bit more like that. Let's feather those quite a bit. And then we're going to make each of these a subtract matte. But I don't want to completely subtract out the faces. I just want them to be at about a third. So I'm going to change their opacity to 66% each. And now, when I dial the opacity up or down, you can see her face in particular is looking happy. And I can go up as high as that. Let's just turn it on and off. It's making a profound difference. It's probably too strong. Somewhere around there is going to do it. So now I do the same thing on the other shot, and then I will meet you on the last shot. There's another option here that you may see me use later in the course, but I'm not sure if we're going to get to it. So just in case, here I used a solid color of orange for the light wrap, and that's fine because this is a very orange background. A lot of backgrounds have variation in them, and they'll have light and dark areas, and you don't want to just straight up put one color or brightness level of background behind everything. And in that case, you can use the shot itself as the light wrap, the background. You can basically wrap that in, and that way, let's say you add it in, then only the bright areas are actually going to wrap, and the dark areas are going to just stay as is. Now, this is kind of hand waving. I'm just telling you about this. It adds more steps, so we didn't do it here. You may see me do it later in the course, but if not, just keep it in your mind that that is another option that you have. Here's the basic setup for the final shot. Now, there's bad news and good news. The bad news we already kind of know because we did our dirty key on this, and there are a bunch of issues. Let's just go through them. The car is reflecting green, and so it has holes in what should be solid areas. That's not too big a deal. There are windows around the car that have translucency, and we want to try to preserve some of that rather than just have the windows disappear, in which case the car just won't look right. Underneath the car are some shadows. Those aren't totally looking right. And there's also some other gunk. And in fact, I can tell you, having been on set, there was a piece of cardboard under this car because it was leaking oil. So that is not going to be part of the final shot. Now that gets into how exactly is just this element going to marry into this environment, which is a design choice. But before we can make that choice, we've got to solve those technical issues. And then we've got our talent. Now, the talent looks okay in some ways. Things that could be really difficult, like the hair, don't look like they're going to be too big a problem. His jeans, for whatever reason, as we pointed out before, are pretty bad. The shoes are a problem, and then there's contact with the ground. And let me just talk about that for a second, because clearly, if we don't take care of some shadows in this scene, it's gonna look like they're just kind of floating on the set. Now, if we go back and take a look at the original shot, and I'll just turn off key light and turn off the mask. We had some shadows on set, and I even set a levels control so you can see them more clearly here. So this is a pretty nice shadow, and it's pointing in the right direction for how the key light of the scene lit it. So we can see the car is lit, appearing to be, from over his left shoulder. That's where the sun is. And it implies that we want to see shadows that point kind of in the same direction as you see here. And the wish was put out there like, well, I'd love to key for those shadows. Well, you can see a couple immediate problems with that. These cards are not green, and they're not keyable. And so the shadow we've got there is just a reference. But even if those cards weren't there, there are shadows pointing in other directions, and that happens 99 out of 100, or even 999 out of 1,000 times on a set. Because on set, you can't recreate the sun with a single point of light, because you can't make it far enough away. So you have to use fill lights. The fill lights are going to ruin your realistic shadows. It's going to make things complex. That's actually a good thing, because as a compositor or designer, making the shot look well lit when it was badly lit is going to be impossible. Dealing with recreating some shadows is possible. Not to mention that there are some reference shadows in this scene. The terrain's got a certain look to it where it's shaded. And so we've already set a style. And so I'm making the executive decision that my shadows are not going to look like natural shadows, and we're going to somehow marry them with this surrounding environment. It never fails when you put talent on a floor of a green screen set that somebody wants to try to preserve the shadows. And I would caution you not to do that. The reason is that the lighting on a set is not straightforward enough to give you good shadows in almost any case. And you certainly don't want to constrain your DP to lighting the shot for shadows, unless indeed they're the most important thing, which they basically never are. You can, for a daylit shot, shoot it outside, and that would give you the single point source of the sun. So you'd get a really good shadow off of that. You'd need a big mat, but that is a way that it is done even at some of the finest facilities in the world. Trying to recreate the sun on a stage is impossible because you can't get the light source far enough away to light the scene that way. And you also lose all your control when you do that. So, bottom line, bite the bullet and don't worry about floor shadows and fix them in post. Now let's focus just on this car for a moment. Now, while the car would make an incredibly difficult key, the real question to ask may be, to what extent do we need to key this car? I'm on the end frame here, and if I go to the start frame using the home key, there is no difference between these two frames. So advantage number one is this is basically a static element. In fact, it is a completely static element. Back in the day, shooting film, we'd get a little gate weave, there'd be some movement, but this thing is not moving at all. And we didn't add a dolly shot or any other movement that would make this a lot more complex. So that means any hard area of the car, anything solid, is basically something we can handle with a mask. So that leads us to take a look at, okay, what's not solid? And that would basically be the window area, obviously. Now, windows get done wrong sometimes, and the best reference is always right there in the shot itself. So look at the color of the background, and then notice that when there's a single pane of glass, like the back window, there's really barely a difference there. But as the panes of glass double up, and as we get some glare on them, you can see the glass a little bit. So we want to preserve some of that transparency, and that's going to be a little tricky. In addition, the DP lit this very nicely. This glare on the windshield here, although artificial, is really nice looking. So we want that, I think. I suppose you could make the argument that the shape in that glare is pretty clearly from a light fixture, and that makes it not so good. But I don't think that to the general public that's necessarily what they would see. And I like using things we get in the shot, if at all possible. Another option would be to recreate that and make it look more like, I don't know, some clouds or something. But let's just say that we want to keep that for sure. Well, I'm going to skip the whole process of keeping you in suspense, and I'm also going to skip the process of rotoing this thing by hand, and I'll show you the solution I came to here. So one master mask that just handles the outside of the car is the first step. And if I boost the exposure on the shot, notice how carefully I've gone into the areas where you can't quite see what's going on and made some decisions about what is part of the car. So without the light boosted, it's really hard to tell where's the edge of the tire, etc. But I'm being precise and accurate about that for my first pass. And then the rest of these masks are taking advantage of the fact that this is a static shot. I would probably add them even if it weren't a static shot. I'd have to track them in, but I don't have to do that. So really it was just a question of drawing these. The reason that there are this many of them is each one is serving a different purpose. But notice what's going on here. This mask is actually just for the back right window. That's actually the only part that really truly has to be keyed in this whole shot, because that's where I'm trying to preserve this glare pattern but let some of the background through. All of the rest of these are just varying degrees of a little bit of transparency instead of just completely knocking out the green. So when we key this, we may knock out all the green in there. And so these masks have the purpose of just bringing back a little bit of opacity. Here is the matte in action with the relevant settings exposed in the timeline. And one thing that's interesting to notice is the amount of green, even without keying these translucent areas, is pretty non-existent. I'm not talking about the spill on the car, but there might be a slight green hue to where I've simply rotoed out. I haven't applied the key at all, right? So the windows could just be handled with a color correction. And if I enable key light, it's doing too much until I'm just going to go Shift E to reveal effects and the key light compositing options. I'm going to add just the glare key. And in fact, key light's doing too much right now. So I'll reset it, and we're going to do the same process as always, but with a different approach in mind. So rather than trying to get an overall great key, all I care about is that one area. Let's see what happens if we do it the regular way. Status. really hard to tell in status view which is the right green to select. Let's just go with something that's getting most of the background in that area there. And let's take a look at the intermediate result. Yeah, okay, so with a matte like this, I can go ahead and use these clip settings. Let me just make sure about that matte that I set, so it somehow didn't get set. There we go. And let me hide the masks for a moment. Okay, so this is going to look a little different because it's green behind there and not here. But that looks like about the right amount of transparency. And then I think the other thing we're going to want to do is introduce a little bit of clip black, just quiet down the areas where the key is actually meant to happen. Now, the other thing to notice is in my masks, the subtract masks, which are all these individual windows. Let me just unhide them again. So this area around here where I've excluded the rear view and everything else that had a lot of spill on it, and the back window, I can close this back here, the back wing, front wing. These all have been set as subtract masks, and then I've just come down just slightly on the opacity of the subtract, which means I'm adding back the foreground. So if I bring opacity down further, more and more of the shot comes back in. So I'm just going 90%. I'm letting in 10% of the background. And again, everything else I'm going to handle with a color correction rather than trying to get perfect translucency in that window. Things to watch out for still would be any noise or grain showing up in such a gentle, delicate matte as this. But basically, all I now have to do is add Advanced Spill Suppressor. Probably look nicer at Ultra default. And the hardest part of the shot would seem to be done. So anytime you see a hard edge against a color key, like a green screen or blue screen, just keep it in mind that if it's giving you any difficulty at all, it's a hard edge object and you have other tools at your disposal besides keying to take care of it. If you do it that way and you don't let its edges compromise the edges that actually count, which are the organic ones, your talent, then you're going to get a much, 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 much better result out of doing it that way. The next step is to garbage matte just the talent where we actually do need the main keying to happen. And remember, I'm not worrying about those floor shadows. So let's start with something like that. Go back to our good friend key light and evaluate what we've got here. So we saw in the dirty key that there was an issue with his pants, and we know that the floor is a bit different. So I'm going to go with something like that, and looks pretty good. Let's see. Interesting. So here's a case where screen balance is behaving differently depending on whether we look at the pants or the shirt. So at 50, they're kind of balanced. At 5, the shirt's happier. And then 95, the pants are happier. So, well, we could split this apart. That's one way to go. Let's just focus for now on the top part, because that looks like it's going to have the most success. And remember, all the edges that overlap with the car, I don't need to worry about. So all this area in here by the fender, it's already covered. We can screen matte this while still in status view, and then switch over to intermediate. Take a look at that matte. The edges look great. There are a few holes in the matte. No surprise there. The holes down here really are not that bad. I realize the floor is not super clean, but this looks like a valid starting point. And I'm now going to make the executive decision to pre-comp so that we can add a core matte and just build this up. Okay, we don't really need that so much now. So the core mat could be similar, but probably gonna be a little different. I really said absolutely nothing just now. So what I mean is, let's start by kind of crushing the mat that we've got. We got to go pretty far. So I am going to suggest starting over on this one. And this time, I'm going to get my eyedropper from the floor. And then, yeah, that's pretty good. And then we already know the screen balance should be in the middle. And now if I crush this one, well, the answer is going to be to choke and spread, or rather spread and then choke. And the floor and the shoes are problematic. So in fact, I would also say that there's a decision to be made there, but let's just worry about that in a moment. So here, working an intermediate result as always, and actually, no, I was where I wanted to be. I'm just going to take that, call this spread. I'm just going to fill those holes, and then apply it again. Call this one choke. Bring it back in, toggle it. Looks like my edges are being left alone, which is great. The feet are solid, but so is part of the floor. But the thing to really be caring about is the hair, especially hers, and that is unaffected by this core mat. Awesome. So the floor is not looking too good, but it brings to mind a trick that I haven't shown you yet that I think will work perfectly here. When I make a G mat or a garbage mat, you notice that I'm not very consistent about calling these C mat, G mat, garbage mat, garbage. Consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. I didn't make that up. I'm just quoting. I'll solo the garbage layer, and what I want to do is make this a very hard mat, and I want to mat out all that glop on the floor. So I've crushed this mat. Having done that, I'll take the choke off, because all I want to do now is just spread this baby. So let's even quiet that down more. The car doesn't matter. And having done that, let's focus on spreading the mat. And let's actually look at it while we do this. So to make it really obvious what's happening, I'm going to go hard on this thing. And this is a different way of creating a garbage mat and doing it procedurally. So remember, the edge is all that matters. And therefore, what I've done here is get all of my edge, but without doing any real roto. And then I apply it the same way I did in an earlier lesson with a stencil alpha that then holds out, and so all of that stuff on the floor is gone. So if this trick always worked of just crudely matting the thing, spreading a little bit, and isolating just the part that counts, which is just the edge, I would use it all the time. This just happens to be a case where it's just the right thing for the job. And to be honest, you should try it out, because you may find cases where you get pretty good at doing this. And again, it will reduce what you have to key down to just a handful of pixels all the way around. There is some fringing in the mat down here, and yet I'm happy with how the hair looks up above. So the choice now is simple, and that is to break the edge mat into an upper and lower. Now, I know, but we've gone this far, so this is a trivial extra step to make the mat that much better. Let's bring this up right around waist level. Car doesn't matter. Duplicate. Call this one lower. Put it below upper in the layer stack, and then I'm not really OCD. And then I'm going to just bring this down. Now the other change that I'm going to make is to cut off the feet. I don't have to do this, but in thinking about it, see if you can follow me on this. We're going to need shadows below the feet and the wheels of the car. And those are done with contact shadows, which means we're going to need little holdouts of the feet. And the feet actually move around in the shot. If I just go through the shot a little bit, you can see she's going to repo her feet. So we're going to need the feet as an element. So I'm going to remove them from this mask, and that's going to save me having to worry about what's going on down here where the feet hit the floor. It'll just be a separate problem. Okay, so I don't have to be super careful about where to cut this, but let's see if I can just kind of nicely, might as well cut out the car over there. Just bring this down here. Mostly I just need to make sure that as they move, and I don't really particularly want to animate this, it doesn't have to be that good. All right, and the glop below the tire is kind of a thing, but let's not worry about that right now. So let's see. All I'm doing now is in this lower mat, just coming in on the clip black until all that's gone. That looks pretty good. Remember, the car doesn't matter. Okay, having done the sloppy work, it's time for the refined work. I really do want this mat just right down around the feet on both of them. The core is giving me this glop over here. That is easy to fix. Just cut in right there. Just going right, because the wheel doesn't move, so it can go right in there. That's good. And then I'm going to steal this lower mat path and adapt it to the garbage mat so that that also avoids the feet. And we'll just, and now I'll preview the mat like that. Better yet, let's take a look at it in the full shot. Well, this would look a lot better with some spill suppression, but the upper body here looks great. And down here I just see we've got some issues between the pant legs, and something's going on right there. And my garbage mat around her feet is going to need a little help. So let's bring that in there. And so all that difficulty is happening from the core mat, which isn't doing a whole lot over here. Well, no, it's really not, because that's the car wheel, so that's not helping us there either. So in fact, I go into the core mat and just go a lot further, taking it out of here. We can, well, actually, let's just see. That's pretty crude, but yeah, I mean, there's some issues down here, but the feet are going to be a separate pass. So that's in the overlap area of that. And in any case, oh, no, they're included. So let's just make sure. Yeah, that's good. In the wide, the tire's taken care of. We've still got a little bit of an issue there, but it's not coming from this. That's interesting. So in fact, the problem is with my car roto, believe it or not. There we go. Yeah. So having taken care of all that, now it's down to the feet. Here in Mocha, I was able to get some good roto of the feet. It only required a certain amount of hand keyframing on each of those. And with that, I applied masks to the layer, made some adjustments to the garbage and core mats to clean that up, and here is where we're at. Now, in a lot of productions, this would be final. We wouldn't mind that they're just kind of floating above this orange sea of a ground plane. But you and I are not going to leave it there. We're done with the keying portion of this keying lesson, But part of what's involved with keying is also filling in the gaps that are left when you pull a key. So I'm not convinced, obviously, even by the way the tires and the feet are making contact with the ground. And then beyond that, they and the car should be casting some sort of shadows. And I'm going to use the shading that I see here in the landscape as inspiration for how to do that. We also need to match them into the scene. And those three things, I think, will finish the shot. To prepare for the next step, I created a mat that just has the bottoms of the tires and the feet. And this is going to be used for what's called a contact mat. Now, just because contact shadows belong to the world of side-scroller video games from the 80s and 90s doesn't mean they're not useful. So here I have really just hold-out mats for the tires of the car, and I'm taking advantage of having rotoed the feet. And in my main comp, this has been applied like so. It's just got a color that will look plausibly like a fairly invisible shadow, and it's meant to be subliminal. And part of the reason for that is it's just not really correct. If you look at the source footage, when he lifts his foot, the shadow should lift in a mirror direction. Now, we could do that, but I don't think anybody's going to be looking for it. And the point about these types of shadows is you just don't really want them to work at any level other than, oh, okay, now it doesn't look like they're just totally floating anymore. So we're not done with our shadows, but that would be the bare minimum starting point. It's not always the case that you just want the most sophisticated solution. It would be great if we had nice procedural accurate shadows here. And yet, this is reminding me of when I worked on Spy Kids 3D, which is a video game world, and we did a lot of contact shadows, which made us feel cheap and dirty, but was actually the perfect thing for that environment. And I think we have a similar type of environment right here. So suppose you're lazy and uncreative like me, and you wanted to create some shadows that look like they're being cast by the sun. Well, you could do worse than to just trace what was right there on the floor. And if you really want to be lazy about it, just go ahead and set a keyframe every 10 frames without regard for what's actually changing frame to frame. And that should be good enough. And then when you go back to applying it in the comp, you may notice that, oops, you should have probably extended it beyond the border of the video since we're putting it into a larger frame. So you can go ahead and make another mat to extend that. And of course the car is not moving, so we don't really have to worry about animating the couple of masks that are making the mat for that one. Now over here in the main scene, it just doesn't look quite right, even with the shadows color matched, to have them just be pools like this. And upon closer examination, one sees the precedent in the scene for shading. So let's go with this. How do we do it? I'll create a solid, and we're going to call this shadow pattern, and let's trim it. And I could use a couple of different effects. So under noise and grain, there is of course fractal noise, and then there is turbulent noise, which is more or less identical. I believe it is GPU accelerated, or was at one time when fractal noise was not. And I think there's a slight difference how it loops, which is not important here because we're not going to animate it. I'm really only using it to just let you know that the two are mostly identical, and you can use really either one in most cases. So sticking with basic, but going to block. It's kind of an interesting bit of artwork there, isn't it? Let's go to transform and set non-uniform scale. The pattern that I saw when I zoomed in there was some really small, wide pixels. So let's go 12 by 3, and I'll just zoom in. That's more or less what I want. I'm going to be able to use the brightness to determine how dense or sparse it feels. And I can, increase the contrast a bit as well so that I don't have very many of these that are gray. I think I want them to basically be black or white. Something like that. So that's going to be my pattern, which I will set via a Lumimat, and voila. I can now adjust to taste. This is a fill effect, so it looks a little saturated. So I can just lower the saturation just a skosh, not so much that it discolors it. And maybe also the brightness should come down just a little bit. It's good. It's a little bit strong, so I can also dial down the opacity here. And that looks great. All right, perfect. So what remains? Matching foreground and background. I'm going to go back to curves. And this time, what the heck? I'm going to not even go channel by channel. I'm going to use the same idea that we had before. So raising the highlight gamma just a bit, but holding down the blacks. Check. Raising the red gamma slightly above center, and lowering blue gamma kind of right in the middle. We don't want things turning green, so we're balancing red against blue for that. And again, just how bright do we want it? Sometimes it helps to really overdo some adjustments to just see where you want them to be. You can also toggle on and off if you're not quite seeing it. Now I'm seeing that, wow, that's actually a pretty strong adjustment, and I think it's working pretty well. The one last thing I would do might be to let a little more red into the blacks. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, something like that. Now, later on I might think, what was I thinking putting that much red in the blacks? But for now, I think I like it. And last looks, it's just a little hot in the whites. Boom. I'm not sure that the keying ended up being all that more advanced, just the keying itself this week, or this lesson, rather than the lesson earlier this week. Rather, I would say that all of the extra stuff that was done to make sure the keys stayed simple and we're still going to come out looking pretty effortless. That's really where the work was this time. And so there are a couple things to take away from that. One, break down your keys in all the ways that you saw here to make them work. And number two, everything that happens on set can really help ensure a great result. All the things I pointed out that were working about the way it was shot, and what we could do with that, and the style of the artwork really helped us succeed. So if you find yourself either in charge of supervising a shoot or designing artwork or both, keep those in mind.
Hey Tracy. What'd the bartender say to the jumper cable?
I couldn't possibly imagine.
I'll get you a drink. Just don't start anything.
Get ready, gearheads. Season 2 of The Lugnuts premieres October 28th, only on Wrench TV.
All right, you good old boys. Happy trails. We'll see you out there on the highway.